everybody. All right, I'm going to keep this intro short and sweet, but over the last year, I have been writing a memoir to share my experience and my journey through stage 4 cancer, and especially what it's like being diagnosed with an extremely rare cancer and kind of sharing the uncertainty that came through that process. My motto pretty much is, if you can't beat fear, do it scared. And that's what I share a lot in my book. I share everything from leading up to the diagnosis and the difficulties I had in being heard or getting past an anxiety diagnosis. And then I also share kind of what the process was like as I learned to advocate for myself. This is the first thing I have ever written, and this first chapter hasn't seen an editor yet. So both the title as well as the first chapter may change by the time it's actually published, but I wanted to share it all here now. And I welcome any feedback. If you like it, if there's things that you don't like, I would love to hear it all. So without further ado, I'm going to share the read of Chapter 1 from Life Refocused, my memoir on a battle with stage 4 cancer. As we arrived at the hospital, the large tents erected at the entrance of the building reminded me of a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie, adding to the intimidation factor. Such strange times we were living in, I thought, as my heart raced with anticipation, and Brian pulled around front to drop me at the door. We'd heard family may not be allowed inside, and although the thought of waiting alone in the ER with nothing more than the company of my racing thoughts sounded like a scene from my nightmares, we knew we didn't have much of a choice. We'd have to make do. I let out a deep exhale as we came to a stop, looking over at Brian one final time before reaching for the door. "You've got this. Everything's going to be okay," he encouraged, grabbing my hand and passing a kiss as I reluctantly unbuckled. "And keep me posted," he reminded me, as I squeezed his hand for confirmation just before stepping out and gently swinging shut the door. My mind raced with a million thoughts, running through every possible scenario of what could go wrong as I made my way to the entrance. My eyes began to fill with tears, overwhelmed by the conflicting emotions. I'd felt like something was off with my body for years, but no one else seemed to agree. I was terrified of what they may find, but equally as scared of leaving once again with unanswered questions and a room full of people who didn't believe me. As I approached the tent, a nurse in full PPE greeted me. As she asked what I'd arrived for, I instantly froze, unsure of what to say, as I retraced my steps through the downward spiral that had led me here. One that can visibly be tracked through my browsing history in the days leading up to my arrival. A broad search for abdominal mass would eventually turn into symptoms of liver tumors, and hours later, I'd find myself in bed, watching a YouTube video over my shoulder while trying to self-examine and palpitate my abdomen for an enlarged liver. I'd knock my phone from the nightstand again and again as I poked and prodded at my stomach with each new set of instructions. I was deep down the rabbit hole, and there was no turning back. I lost myself for hours spiraling through the worst possible scenarios before calling it a night with one last search of the evening for soothing meditation music. A clear attempt to purge the panic that I had brought upon myself. A process I'd start all over again the next day. The following morning, I woke and slid my hand over the upper part of my stomach where I'd felt the firmness beneath my ribs the night before. I couldn't feel it now. Was this all in my head? I continued the search, rolling to my left side and pressing in. Nothing. Then to my right. I felt a fullness and discomfort, but still no hardness or mass. I'd lost nearly 50 pounds over the past few years, most of which came in the last 9 months while actively trying. I channeled my frustrations over my mounting health issues and the inability to get any answers beyond the plethora of anxiety diagnoses building in my chart by going for long, multi-mile walks each day. With the pandemic in full swing, there wasn't much else to do. Plus, the handsome stranger I'd met on the internet a few months ago, who I'd now been cooped up in a house with 24/7, kept dropping hints that he just may have an important question to ask me soon. Important questions are often followed by fancy dresses, so I figured it might be a good time to use these walks to get in shape. Every morning, I'd throw on an hour-long podcast before work and head out for a walk around the neighborhood until it finished. Then I'd come back, work for 8 hours, and do it all again before dinner, typically racking up 5 to 10 miles a day. I'd also revised my diet in an attempt to get my high blood pressure under control, another symptom and a rare find in a young woman my age that no one had answers for. I'd reduced my sodium intake and lived mostly on brown rice, steamed veggies, and ground turkey. Over a few months, this had led to a pretty dramatic weight loss that, even though I had been trying, I started asking doctors about. Combined with my other symptoms, I was worried it could be a reflection of something more serious. They'd assure me it was fine before recommending a new antidepressant for me to get a handle on my health anxiety, which I, in turn, would be too anxious to ever take because I didn't feel like anxiety was the actual problem, leaving us both in a cycle of frustration. I got out of bed and made my way to the bathroom, poking it and feeling around my stomach with one hand while I brushed my teeth with the other. As soon as I caught the edge of it again, I paused, held perfectly still, and called Brian over to take a look before I lost it again. "That lump in my stomach is there again. Can you feel it?" I asked as I reached for his hand. He replied, passing by confused. "The hardness under my ribs. It's right here. Look, feel." I pulled him over and guided his hand to where mine was. "Okay, what exactly am I supposed to be feeling?" he asked, the skepticism clear in his voice. "I don't know. It's hard, like harder than the other side, and the edge is kind of round. Can't you feel it?" I insisted. I could sense his impatience mounting. I caught him as he was headed down to begin work, and he wasn't quite in the mindset to entertain whatever my latest hypochondriac episode seemed to be. Brian had been supportive through all my health issues, but none of my other symptoms ever panned out to be anything other than anxiety according to doctors, and he seemed to be getting a little fatigued. I decided to wait for him to go downstairs before making my way over to the full-length mirror in our closet for a better look. As I stood in front of the mirror, I'd suck in, twist to the side, crunch, and turn, trying to get a glimpse of the elusive protrusion. After several tries, I started to pick up on the specific combination of breath holding, flexing, and sticking my stomach out in just the right manner to expose the bump. When I got the combination just right, I gently pressed in and slightly cut my hand around it. What was this thing? Well, I'd never been able to cut my hand around it the way I was now. The firmness was something that I remember identifying a couple of years ago. Something I distinctly remember because whenever I'd start a new diet or go on a workout streak, I'd always compare my body in the mirror, searching for progress. Sucking in, twisting, and flexing, honestly not too dissimilar from the contortions I'd just been making, but for reasons far more vain at the time. During one of these comparisons, I found a firmness on my right side and remember wondering if it could be little budding baby abs. I'd been overweight most of my life, and at 170 pounds on a short 5'1" frame, I liked the idea of progress brewing beneath the weight I struggled to melt off. I mentally congratulated myself for a job well done, and while I hadn't been met with the same firmness on the other side, I figured it might just need a little extra effort and attention to catch up. I reflected on that memory as I poked at it some more. I noticed the firmness before, but I didn't ever remember feeling any edges, something I swear I could feel now. I didn't know what this was, but knew it was going to eat at me until I found out. In an effort to distract myself, I decided to get dressed, start work, and try to forget about it for a few hours, which worked well until I closed my laptop at the end of the day and all the worries and intrusive thoughts, wondering if it could be cancer resurfaced. After dinner, I went back to Google on my quest to determine what it could be and if it was worth a trip to urgent care when mid-search, Mom called. This wasn't exactly a surprise. Although we'd had plenty of trying times during my adolescence, she'd morphed into my best friend at my first call in adulthood. We spoke daily, so this was just another Wednesday evening. That night, I caught her up on all my recent doctor's appointments and the new hardness I was feeling just beneath my ribs. She began rattling off ideas of harmless propositions of what it may be, but the more I described what I had been feeling, the more the fear rushed in, and I felt myself starting to get choked up. With a motherly concern, she gently asked what was wrong. The culmination of my worries piling up and all the times I had spent in doctors' offices asking if we could rule out cancer finally caught up to me as I admitted, "I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm just worried we've caught it too late. That it's stage 4 and it's already gone to my liver." A comment prompted by a spiraling Google search, but one that still haunts me to this day, given the predicament I found myself in a few hours later. As we wrapped up the conversation, I looked up urgent cares around me. It was getting late, and tomorrow was New Year's Eve. If I was this worked up over it, and I didn't want to be torturing myself over the holidays, it'd be best to get it checked out now. At 8 p.m., many of the urgent cares around me had already closed, but there was one still open down the road, about 15 miles from where we lived, closing in 30 minutes. With no time left to second-guess myself, I decided to head in. As I arrived, the parking lot was well lit but empty. It was clear I was going to be the last patient for the evening. I counted the cars in the parking lot and questioned if I should even go in at all. Walking into an urgent care 10 minutes before closing felt like walking into a restaurant as they were stacking the chairs and sweeping under the tables. Surely everyone would be annoyed. As I made my way to the counter to check in, I could feel my heart racing as I apologized for arriving so late. The young woman at the desk could clearly sense my anxiety, assuring me it would be okay before inquiring about what brought me in. I froze and stumbled through my words. What led me to that moment felt like a culmination of far more than I could communicate in one single sentence. "I've started to feel a hardness just beneath my ribs," I fumbled out, breaking eye contact and gazing off to the corner of the building I wish I could disappear to. My confidence had been shaken. I hadn't had the best relationship with the medical system. Over the past few years, I found myself in the ER twice and in countless doctors' offices in pursuit of symptoms. I never left with any answers, typically just a new anxiety diagnosis added to my chart and an overwhelming sense of guilt and shame that I'd wasted everyone's time. Worried that this evening would follow the same path, I averted my gaze to save myself from the judgment I was sure would be coming my way. But instead of judgment, I noticed her eyes soften as I was met with compassion. "Well, let's make sure we get you back to get it looked at. Are you in any pain?" I wasn't quite sure how to answer that question. I'd been feeling a mild ache for several days, but it was difficult to pinpoint, and it was so dull that it often made me wonder if it was all in my head. A very dull pain that comes and goes, I responded as I passed my license and insurance under the plexiglass barrier. A few clicks, taps, and a quick scan later, she passed them back. Okay, Miss Mosman, have a seat over there, and we'll call you soon. We don't have anyone waiting, so it should be quick. Miss Mosman, I'd almost forgotten that I hadn't had a chance to completely change my name since Brian and I got married 2 months prior. I'd filled out all the paperwork, but was still waiting for an appointment with the driver's license and Social Security office. Both were booked out several months due to the pandemic. I filed the cards back into my wallet and sat in the open lobby, taking in my surroundings while waiting to be called back. The building was new, with large windows and an open concept, something I'd come to enjoy about all the University of Utah clinics in the past few years. There was something about watching the hustle and bustle of people making their way to their appointments and healthcare workers mingling in the hallways that offered a welcome distraction from the wait. But as the last patient in for the night, tonight it looked much different. The halls were empty and the building was cold and quiet, leaving me alone with my worries and all the what-ifs. Thankfully, it wasn't long until a nurse appeared at the doorway to call me back, and we made our way to a room. As she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm and placed the pulse ox on my finger, I watched her facial expression as she caught my heart rate. 122, are you nervous? I had a rapid heart rate for a while now and was used to this reaction. Before being medicated for it, it was normal for me to clock in around 145 to 165 beats per minute. So honestly, 122 felt pretty reasonable. She had me take a few slow, deep breaths until we got it down to 113 and my blood pressure to 144/88 before logging it into the chart and letting me know someone would be in shortly to see me. The door rolled shut behind her, and I could hear voices of the other nurses down the hall discussing their plans for New Year's as they were closing up for the evening. As the voices trailed off, I heard footsteps approaching my room before a man walked in and introduced himself as Casey, the nurse practitioner who'd be taking care of me that evening. He was relaxed and unrushed as he asked what had brought me in. I told him about the dull ache that had been coming and going in my upper right abdomen and the mass that I'd recently discovered. He acknowledged my concerns, nodded slowly, then paused, waiting for me to continue. I was so used to being rushed through appointments and having my symptoms explained away that I was caught off guard at first. Wait, what else am I supposed to tell him? Do I let him know I've been Googling my symptoms all day, or do I keep those details close to the chest? I wasn't used to being given time to fully detail my symptoms. I'd usually start, then would be cut off with the same leading questions that always pointed us back to anxiety. I avoided eye contact as I continued, sharing with him what had really led me to come in. Honestly, I don't know what's wrong, but I've been looking at my symptoms, and I'm a little worried about it being an enlarged liver. So I wanted to come in and get it looked at before the holiday. I felt ashamed to admit I've been Googling my symptoms all night. I'm sure they hated when patients do that. But as I looked up, I wasn't met with an ounce of judgment. He nodded once more, asked a few follow-up questions, then requested I hop up onto the table so he could take a look. As I laid back, he began poking and pushing against my abdomen in a similar fashion to the video I'd watched the night before. While he made his examination, I explained that I hadn't been able to feel it while I was lying down, but it was more noticeable when I was standing. So he had me stand back up and show him there instead. I positioned my stomach in just the right position and showed him where my hand cupped around it. He then examined the area himself. After palpating the mass and following up with a few questions, he acknowledged that he was able to feel it too. He thought it could have been an enlarged liver and suggested that I follow up with my PCP or that I go to the ER to get it further evaluated. I had already mentioned it to my PCP a day or two prior, who didn't seem too concerned. That didn't feel like a viable option. However, I was nervous about going to the ER. With the pandemic in full swing, I'd heard about how full the hospitals were, and I didn't want to be a distraction if this turned out to be nothing. However, after years of being dismissed, Casey was the first person to ever take me seriously. I felt safe in disclosing my concerns to him and asking if it was really worth going to the ER for. He further explained to me that when things go wrong, they often go wrong in our head and in our abdomen. With this mass being in my abdomen, he felt it was completely reasonable to get it checked out by the ER, then assured me I wouldn't be a distraction. As we wrapped up, he asked if I had any final questions. I had a million, but he had already been so generous with his time, I limited myself to a few more before thanking him for his time and patience. A thank you that didn't feel adequate for how much I truly appreciated his attentiveness. In a single 30-minute appointment, Casey had made me feel more heard than I'd felt in years. As I walked out of the clinic and back to the car, I began mulling over if I should head to the ER. I wasn't in a tremendous amount of pain, and besides the hardness in my abdomen, overall, I felt okay. This didn't exactly feel like an emergency. But I had a nagging feeling that something was wrong, that no matter what I did, I couldn't seem to shake. So I decided to head in. Now that I found myself here, I wasn't quite sure how to explain it all to the intake nurse. Casey seemed to think it was an enlarged liver, but I didn't know if it actually was. Do I say that? The nerves shook my voice as I stammered through an explanation that the urgent care had sent me over, and my hands shook as I fumbled through my wallet for my insurance card. Her eyes softened with compassion as she noticed the tears forming behind my eyes while I searched for a better explanation. "It's okay. Let's just get you inside," she reassured, passing me a mask and ushering me into the tent for screening. With no one else waiting, she guided me through the process with the next nurse, relaying information so I didn't have to run through it all again. Then, once cleared, personally escorted me and my green wristband through the makeshift hallways to the main entrance. "You've got it from here," she encouraged, holding the door and gently ushering me inside. I waited anxiously in the cold, nearly empty lobby before being called back and greeted by a chaotic scene on the other side. Beeping monitors, nurses bustling to and from room, and a handful of patients lining the hallways. The fast-paced yet organized frenzy reminded me of a busy intersection as I tried to keep up with the nurse escorting me back to the room. Why'd they always walk so fast? My short little legs struggled to keep up. Before I knew it, we reached our destination, and I got settled in, waiting for the doctor's arrival. I had even been informed by the EMT starting my IV that Brian was allowed to come back and join me. I couldn't have been more relieved and instantly shot him a text, hoping he'd make it before the doctor arrived. But just as the EMT walked out of the room, a young doctor walked in. He briefly introduced himself before inquiring what had brought me here. As I began explaining my symptoms and that the urgent care had sent me in for a possible enlarged liver, the skepticism was clear on his face. He had me laid back and began poking and prodding at my upper right abdomen, just as Casey had done a few hours prior. "Any pain here?" he asked while pushing in, one hand layered over the other. "No," I replied. He adjusted locations and tried again. "What about this?" No pain," I confirmed. And just like that, as quickly as he started the exam, he now finished and was removing his gloves as he shook his head. "Yeah, I don't know what they're talking about. I don't feel an enlarged liver," he confirmed, matter-of-factly, in a bit of a dismissive and rushed tone. My cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Great, he thinks I'm a hypochondriac. Was I just wasting everyone's time? In an attempt to sound far more casual and relaxed than I actually was, I informed him that I felt it most while standing, and that's how the nurse practitioner had felt it as well. He reaffirmed that he didn't find anything during the exam, but suggested if I really wanted to, he could order a CT just to be sure. Even if he felt a bit skeptical, this was far more than anyone else had been willing to explore. I was grateful he was willing to do a more thorough workup, so before he left the room, I took time to pass along a sincere and honest thank you, letting him know how much I appreciated him putting in the order just in case. He caught the tears forming behind my eyes as I shared the gratitude, causing him to pause just before he left the room. I felt his demeanor soften as he took a step back towards the bed. He placed a reassuring hand at the edge, letting me know we'd get everything checked out and he'd be back around to check on me soon. Due to my age, and worried about the radiation they may expose me to with a CT, he ended up placing an order for an ultrasound instead. And soon, the young, friendly EMT who had started my IV earlier appeared back at the door. He casually spun a wheelchair at the foot of the bed as he gestured for me to hop in. I looked back at him, perplexed. My legs were fine. Surely I could walk. "The halls get a bit chilly, and we've got a ways to go. If you're feeling up for it, you can walk, or you can hitch a ride with me," he said, offering me up a warm blanket he'd placed on the seat. Already freezing from the glamorous hospital gown hanging off my shoulder and missing half its buttons, I bundled myself in the blanket and took him up on the offer. As he wheeled me out, I looked back towards a man on a bed just outside my room. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, was kicked back with one leg outstretched, and seemed awfully chipper for a man boarded in the halls of the ER. I asked my new chauffeur about him, inquiring if he'd been there long. "I feel bad that I have a room while he's out there," I added, feeling guilty over the fact that I wasn't exactly in much pain and was probably causing a whole bunch of fuss over nothing while occupying a room. My comment seemed to catch the EMT off guard. "Oh, no, don't feel bad," he insisted. "He hasn't been here long, and he's about to get discharged. That room is yours for as long as you need it. We've got you." We continued to make small talk as we made our way through the bowels of the hospital before finally reaching our destination. "Good luck in there. Have them ping me when you're done, and I'll be back to pick you up. I'll grab a fresh blanket for you too," he instructed as I hopped out. As I entered the room, a bubbly ultrasound tech greeted me and politely asked how I was doing while I settled in and she prepped the equipment. Trying to make light of the situation through nervous laughter, I replied, "Oh, been better." She chuckled softly, spreading the warm gel across my stomach. "This shouldn't take long. We'll get you back to the room soon," she assured as she began the exam. Then, just as the pressure from the moron pressed in towards my ribs, the dynamic in the room shifted, and I watched all emotion drain from her face. She lifted up, pivoted, and went back for a better look. Then another, and another, feverishly clicking away to capture the images. My heart began to race. She'd found something. After a few minutes of silence while she worked, she asked, concerned, "How's your blood pressure?" My blood pressure had been high for a number of years, one of the complaints I've been presenting to doctors with that was continuously explained away by anxiety. But I was unsure of how that could be related to the ultrasound. It's not great, I replied, followed by more nervous laughter. Except this time, there was no laugh back. Minutes felt like hours as she continued on, gliding the wand across my stomach, pushing and twisting it into position. With no response, I lay there in silence, torturing myself, and wondering what could be on the other side of that screen. About halfway through the exam, she followed along my right rib cage until it met in the middle, pressed in, and then let out a distressed sigh. She paused, trying to gather herself as she wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. I didn't know what she'd found, but I knew it couldn't be good. I watched her battle the emotions as she tried to mask her concern and couldn't help but wonder how often she finds herself in this position. How often does she discover something that she knows will forever change the life of the person in front of her? Knowing for a brief moment she's the only one in the world who knows, but is unable to say a word. I can't imagine the toll that must take. Back in the room, I waited with Brian as the results and bad news slowly started filing in over the next few hours. Someone stopped by to tell us they'd seen something on my liver, but not to worry, and they were sending me for a CT for a better look. As if our room had suddenly become radioactive, anyone delivering us news exited as quickly as possible before we had time for any questions, stopping in for quick updates with one foot out the door, and leaving us behind with a live bomb to disarm with a Google search and trembling hands. In less than 24 hours, we'd gone from looking up the best neighborhoods to raise a family in to Googling survival stats. How'd we end up here? And that is the end of the chapter. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for listening and for supporting this effort. I'm donating 100% of my proceeds from this book to research, so the support really means a lot to me and I can't thank you enough. If you'd like to be notified of the release, again, you can sign up at katiekickscancer.com. I'll put the details in the description below. And since this is currently still a work in progress, I would love to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you thought of the first chapter. And as always, like, subscribe, and do the things. All right, see y'all.